The Georgia Bulldogs are about 6 practices into spring practice, and there are a few position groups that I think are undergoing legitimate battles right now. They might not get decided during spring, but what happens in spring is going to go into that. I think in the secondary, I think they're undergoing battles at corner and safety, and part of that's based off of the verbiage we heard from Kirby Smart. Part of that is just knowing where the roster's at in terms of turning it over at that spot. Offensive line clearly is undergoing some battles. 4 of the 5 offensive line starters gone. And I think on the defensive line and in the edge rusher room, I think that's where you're getting some real battles. So more on the defensive side of the ball, I think that the offense, both sides of the ball will be versatile in rotating guys. But I think in terms of who are going to be the primary guys, probably a little bit more on defense. I want to break down these 3 position battles. Ryan Curley from Dawg Post talking about competition going on during spring practice. I think that, as Kirby said earlier on in the spring a couple weeks ago, hey, look, there's competition at every position. This is the University of Georgia. They're going to compete every single day in practice for their jobs, and that's how he wants it, and that doesn't exclude the quarterbacks, right? But we're not talking about Gunnar Stockton or Ryan Puglisi here. That's not what this is about. Let's kick it off with the offensive line room. Okay, 4 guys going to the NFL. Xavier Truss, Dylan Fairchild, Tate Ratledge, Jared Wilson. Primary starters on the offensive line last year. Some of them primary starters for the last few years, right? Tate Ratledge, Xavier Truss, been around for a few years, starting. So with Georgia, one of the things that I think is pretty unique with them is how much they rotate in that offensive line room. So when you look at, hey, they got to replace 4 guys, the good thing for Georgia, and Kirby has mentioned this already, and not that we weren't aware, but the good for Georgia is that rotation creates depth for the future. And that's why Georgia rotates. Sometimes I think they're, it's just my opinion. Sometimes I wonder, hey, are they rotating a little bit too much? Are they kind of lacking momentum? But the reason why they do it is because when they're in a situation like this where 4 guys are off to the league and they don't know whenever someone could transfer, they have guys that are stepping up who have started games, who have played big snaps of big games. The center's probably going to be Drew Bobo. I don't know if there's much of a competition there. He's one of those guys that has started some games partially because Jared Wilson dealing with an injury last year and has rotated in there before. So Drew Bobo at center, I think, is probably what you're going to get. And look, Kirby wants experience in these snaps. One of the guards is going to be Micah Morris. He started games in the past 2. He rotated a lot with Dylan Fairchild at the guard position. So those 2 guys are ones that, look, they've played a lot. Another guy who's gotten some big-time snaps, and look, reviews are all over the place with him. It's Monroe Freeling. He played a little bit in 2023 as a freshman, played some last year, played more at the end of the season when Ernest Green dealing with some injuries, right? So he's dealing with an injury himself right now, which kind of leaves the door open for more competition at that tackle spot. Ernest Green's a guy who's got a lot of snaps under his belt. I think he'll probably end up being one of the starting tackles for Georgia. So you kind of have 3 of the starters somewhat figured out when you look at the offensive line room. But I do think there's open competition at some of the spots. Will Monroe Freeling win one of those tackle jobs? It won't help him that he isn't practicing this spring. Does Ernest Green have it in the bag? I think he probably does. So younger guys are getting reps. Daniel Calhoun is a guy that has gotten a lot of buzz as someone who may be a starter at one of the guard positions. And Jordan Hall on Tuesday night kind of revealed to us, hey, someone that was starting and getting the reps with the ones in practice at the tackle position is another second-year guy in Michael Uni. I have a hard time pronouncing his name. Michael Uni. So that's a younger guy who's getting first-team reps. So with some of these guys dealing with injuries and some people just being inexperienced, some of the younger players are getting those reps. I think Daniel Calhoun, Michael Uni, Bo Hewley's probably in the mix when you're talking about guys who might be fighting for a spot. Jamal Merriweather, probably going to get some of those reps. Malachi Tolliver, probably going to get some of those reps. They've got a ton. Jazeer Jackson, probably going to get reps. So I think there's an open competition for at least 2 of the spots. I think one of the guard spots is certainly up for grabs, and I think that a tackle spot can definitely be up for grabs if they feel like Monroe Freeling or Ernest Green just gets beat out. I think out of the 2, Monroe Freeling's probably a little bit more likely to get beat out as Ernest Green was dealing with an injury and was supplanted by him. But Freeling is one of those guys who started games and has played snaps, who just has experience, so he's going to have a leg up in that. I think that that's one of the rooms that definitely has competition. Moving to the defensive side of the ball, let's talk about the secondary. And Kirby talked about this a little bit too. And this quote, look, I got to see a little bit of practice at this point about 10 days ago roughly. And in the little bit that I saw, it looked like Daniel Harris and Dalen Everett are the starting cornerbacks. Dalen Everett is, of course, cornerback 1 for the Georgia Bulldogs. Cornerback 2 towards the end of the season was Daniel Harris, as he kind of took the job from Julian Humphrey. But it seems like there's competition in the secondary room. And part of why I feel, hey, maybe that cornerback 2 spot is not completely locked up is because of this quote from Kirby, and I'll bring it up for you on the screen. He was asked about the defensive back room and just kind of in general. He goes, yeah, it's good and bad, right? It's flashes. I just want to see fire and compete out of everybody. So it's like I can't label that position as the one, but there's days that you have flashes. I just, competitive toughness is so hard to find nowadays because kids like to take the easy way out, and it's not easy here. So between Daniel Harris, DeMello Jones, Andre Evans, Dom Kelly, Jonte Gilbert, Ellis Robinson IV, they're all out there competing. I'm proud of them all. And Dalen Everett's doing a nice job teaching those guys and setting an example. He's doing more than you probably realize. He goes to Indy and does work and moves around and continues to improve on his own skill set. Part of why he left Dalen Everett out of that is because Dalen Everett is limited this spring, coming off of that, the labrum surgery, but also he's got the job locked up. But he did throw Daniel Harris into this, kind of insinuating that Daniel Harris has to compete for that job, and it's not just going to be handed to him to be one of the starting cornerbacks for Georgia. Ellis Robinson's a guy, obviously, that has a lot of buzz. He's one of the highest ranked recruits ever for the Georgia Bulldogs and one of the highest cornerback recruits ever just in general. And he's entering year 2. DeMello Jones is a very versatile athlete, also entering year 2, did everything at the high school level down at, I believe, Swainsboro, off the top of my head. Andre Evans, another versatile guy. Dom Kelly, Jonte Gilbert, another guy who we didn't mention in this, who is competing in the secondary. A couple of guys. This was mostly at the cornerback spot he's talking about, but in the secondary, there's safety spots up for grabs. KJ Bolden's going to have one of them, but Janelle Aguero competing at star. Todd Robinson, true freshman, apparently is competing for one of the true safety spots. We heard that from KJ Bolden earlier this week. So there's other guys that are competing for these spots. Zion Branch, Zachariah Branch's brother that transferred with him from USC, he's competing for the safety spots. Kyron Jones is competing. Kirby is basically saying, look, we got KJ Bolden, we got Dalen Everett, but the other spots are up for grabs unless it's a little bit of just kind of getting us a little bit confused. The other spot I want to talk about is the defensive line, edge rushers, kind of the front of the defense, not the linebackers. The linebackers to me are set when you talk about Justin Williams, Raylan Wilson, CJ Allen, Chris Cole. I'm talking about in front of that. Christian Miller, I believe, is going to play a lot. I believe Jordan Hall is going to play a lot on the interior line. There's a lot of buzz around Elijah Griffin, true freshman. Will he compete to be in the rotation with Nnamdi Ogboko and Jordan Thomas and Desir Johnson? Will he compete with those guys? And Xavier McLeod? That's going to be one of my questions is, I know that Christian Miller and Jordan Hall are going to be a part of this thing. Who else is going to compete? Because they're not just going to run those two guys in the middle. And then on the edges, is it going to be Gabe Harris? Just because he's one of the older guys? Well, he's limited or not really participating much this spring. If he's not around, does that leave the door open for a Quintavious Johnson, a younger guy? Does it leave the door open for freshmen and Darren, and his last name starts with an I, and I still haven't figured out how to pronounce it. Excuse me, but he high recruit from the state of Georgia. And Isaiah Gibson, 5-star outside linebacker from the state of Georgia. Are those guys going to compete? Is Joseph Jonah Ajonye going to step in as kind of that Michael Williams, Trayvon Walker type of role? The thing is, we just haven't seen a ton out of a lot of these players. And to me, I think that the front is totally under competition, especially when you take into account that there are injuries at that spot. That means that there are extra reps to be had right now, which means there's extra practice and extra eyeballs on some of these players that may have not gotten that originally. So yes, I think that between the defensive front, the secondary, and the offensive line room, there's heavy competition. When you look at the rest of the team, yes, the wide receivers are competing. to be who are going to be the main guys. I have a good idea of that, and we could talk about that in a different video. I think that people are competing to be RB2 behind Nate Frazier. I think obviously Stockton and Puglisi are competing to an extent, but from everything I'm hearing and seeing, it's Stockton as QB1. I think that, the other positions are pretty much set. I think tight end's fairly set, linebacker's fairly set. A couple of those spots are set, but there's competition at a lot of these spots. I think those 3 position rooms are under the most, and part of that's just because of the turnover and all of that leaving from last year, especially on that defensive front between Jalen Walker and Mykel Williams, all those guys going. There's a lot of spots up for grabs right now on the Georgia Bulldogs football team. Thanks for watching.